This podcast is being held in the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. We wish to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is for mental health educational purposes only and should not be relied on as personal advice. Always seek the guidance of a health professional regarding your physical and/or mental health. Opinions expressed are solely those of the individuals involved and may not reflect the views of the Mental Health Foundation Australia. This episode features a personal story of mental health. If you find yourself distressed, please reach out to Mental Health Foundation Australia's national helpline at 1300 643 287 or Lifeline at 13 11 14.
Everyone has their own unique story. Empowering Voices of Harmony welcomes all members of the community to have open and inclusive conversations surrounding their lived experiences. Season 2 will introduce individuals from a range of diverse backgrounds who have found harmony and community despite their struggles. Hear from our guests in their native languages to obtain a full grasp of the difficulties and strengths that it takes to become a truly empowered voice.
Well, I was initially diagnosed maybe 20 years ago with a condition known as bipolar disorder. But more recently, what I wanted to talk about more today was a condition I was diagnosed with a couple of years ago, but probably had for many, many years anyway, which is OCD. And that's something that like I say, I've only been diagnosed with it for a couple of years, but I can tell, that feeling you get when it's like, oh, so that what I did then explains that, and that explains this, and oh. And I sort of had this light bulb moment when I realized that I probably had it my entire life. So that was something that happened that have only been sort of exploring recently in a lived experience sense for myself. But I sort of realized while I was doing it that a lot of the ideas that a lot of people, including myself to begin with, a lot of the ideas people have about it, they sort of misconstrue it. It doesn't make a great deal of sense as opposed to what a lot of people experience. And that's part of what I wanted to talk about was my own experience and how it differs a little bit, quite a lot actually, from what a lot of people think OCD is actually about. OCD, literally the O is for obsessions, and C is for compulsions, and D is for disorder. But anyway, so we have obsessions where the person has sort of these intrusive thoughts that they find very distressing. And as a result, they sort of get the thoughts again and again and again. And the only way that they can see themselves reducing the anxiety that they get from those thoughts is by doing compulsive behaviors. And the classic one that people think of is that they are afraid of germs, for example. So they wash their hands again and again and again, and they put things in order, and they're very clean, and all of these sorts of things. And there's this notion that people have of, oh, I'm very clean, I must be a little OCD, and it's like this notion that if you're clean and orderly, then you must have obsessive compulsive disorder. When in fact you can have obsessive thoughts about literally anything that causes you distress. It could be relationships, it could be that you have distress about cleaning, it could be that you have distress about, there's literally anything that you can think of. I'm struggling to think of specific ideas here because there's just so many of them. But you can have thoughts about religion, you can have thoughts about being on time for things. You can have all sorts of thoughts about anything, so long as they cause you sufficient distress. That's what happens. It can be it can really take over your life if that happens, and the compulsions can. One that I have, for example, the issue that I've had for a while is that the thing that matters to me the most in my life are my relationships, like the people who I care about. That's just a no-go zone for me. If as soon as As soon as I start feeling as though I'm not valued or cared about, or this person doesn't love me, this person doesn't care about me, that's very distressing for me. And the thing that I do when I'm feeling very distressed about things is I start to check. So I'll start to go and I'll go, gee, I wonder if this person really cares about me. They said this the other day. Perhaps I can search the internet and find different parts of it which say, well, if they said this, they definitely meant that, which means they care about me after all. And then I get release. Or I may call up a service and say, hey, I want to talk about something and get reassurance from them. And actually, reassurance is really dangerous for me because the idea here is that if I have these intrusive thoughts about the people close to me, and I randomly call someone and say, "Hey, do you think they feel this way about me?" They say, "No, Andrew, you're being silly," and I'm like, "Oh, I feel better." But then I have the thoughts again, and then I get reassurance, and I feel better, and it goes around and around and around in circles, and I don't get any relief from it because that cycle is always in place. But to my knowledge, it's not technically speaking an anxiety disorder, but what it does involve is that the intrusive thoughts need to cause that anxiety. They need to cause that anxiety that cause you to want to have those compulsive behaviors. I would say, and I'm not a diagnostician, to my experience, an intrusive thought is an automatic thought that pops into your head that is so distressing that it causes you extreme anxiety. So that's what I would call it. And the thing is that a lot of people will say, well, OCD is about being very clean and orderly. But the thing is that a lot of people who manage OCD, they find that these intrusive thoughts and the compulsions they go through are so disruptive to their daily routines that they can't actually clean up things after themselves and they can't actually do the things they need to do to get ready for the day. It gets in the way of their life in a huge way. And as a result, they're not as clean and orderly as many other people would think. People can have intrusive thoughts that they're going to hurt someone, for example. They can, because the thing is that the sort of thing that you would have an intrusive thought about harming someone is if you absolutely would never do that, but the thought that you would causes you that level of anxiety. So you can have thoughts of harming someone, thoughts of harming yourself, thoughts of harming other people who you would never touch, basically. And as a result, that's where the anxiety comes from. And then you think to yourself, well, I've got to try and make sure that I don't have those feelings. So you sort of go into your head and go, now, when did I think that? And why did I think that? And how can I make sure that I don't do it? And things along those lines. And it's actually the way that where it comes from. And like I said, I'm not a diagnostician, but it's regarded as it's sort of like a neurodevelopmental issue. So it's really hard to get to the bottom of it. I don't know enough about the biology of OCD to give any great commentary on that. But what I can say is that OCD is something that it's misunderstood for that reason, but it's also misunderstood because it is a condition which increases the risk of suicide many times over when people go through it. And people don't, that's just something that isn't publicized. That's not in public knowledge. People don't walk into a room and meet someone with OCD and go, wow, this person needs immediate help. For a lot of people, myself included, it's like being a prisoner in your own mind. What I think has really helped me is and this, by the way, this isn't the only way of dealing with it. There's also other things as well that can work. Exposure related therapy is really good, I understand. But there's one thing in particular that worked really well for me, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And I'll just give you a brief overview whilst once again saying that this is not the only way of managing the condition. But the whole idea is that you say you accept what thoughts you have. So that's where acceptance comes in. And you accept your feelings and you say, you know what, I'm going to have thoughts, I'm going to have feelings, I'm not going to wrestle with them, I'm not going to try and push against them, I'm not going to fight them, but at the same time, I'm going to let them come and go. And when those thoughts come and go, I'm not going to try and fight against them. But what I will do is I'll make sure that as the thoughts are coming and going, I'm going to behave in a way which is consistent with my values. So, in that way, the link between the obsession and the compulsion is weakened because you're not fighting against it by using the compulsions every time. So as a result, when you're in that loop, it sort of breaks the loop somewhat because you're not reinforcing all of those thoughts in the same way. I think that when people have strong values and they have a strong sense of self, there's a sense that, you know what, we're not our thoughts. We're not our feelings. We are unique human beings that exist irrespective of whether we have certain thoughts or certain feelings. But you know what? Even if I have intrusive thoughts about harming people, I know what my values are. I know I'm not going to actually go out and physically hurt someone. So if I can go ahead with my values and not do that, the thoughts will come and go. I think early on when I was trying to manage it, it was getting to the stage where it was like, how do I separate myself from what's going on in my? I'm pointing to my head at the moment. You can't see that. How do I separate myself from what's going on in my head? And to me, that's just something that people do when they grow older. They start to realize, hey, I'm not my thoughts. But it's a hard lesson to learn, and it's especially hard when it feels so real, when it feels like that's all that's going on. Actually, one of my first experiences in the Mental Health Foundation Australia, they ran a support group on OCD, which I sat in on a few times before I was actually diagnosed. And I found it fascinating. The Mental Health Foundation, by the way, they run, I think it was 35 different support groups at the moment. They've got huge, they're getting quite good numbers as well. Like in the hundreds of people, 200 people or something along those lines. But yeah, that the other condition I have, which I may talk about some other time, I think, which is bipolar. They've got bipolar groups running, they've got OCD groups running, they've got BPD groups running, all of those sorts of things going. But yeah, what I found was that there was, if there was something that I wanted to talk about, they would have a group on it. And the people who were there are very, very capable and people who I respect very much. And what I found was that the way they ran it and the way that it was structured, it was really easy to just coexist with a group of people who got it. I have been involved in support groups for quite a few years now. I was one of the people who ran a support group in youth depression and anxiety. Going back quite a few years, but I guess the nature of how I would feel now as opposed to then, I see support groups as something that will literally support, as in, I would say that with the groups that as they run, I may not go to them every single week. I would go to them when I literally needed support. I would go to them when I found myself saying, you know what, I'm really struggling here a little bit. I'd like to speak to someone about it. I'd like to share my thoughts and feelings with some people. And those are the times I choose to. There are other people who would go every month and would go to multiple groups per month, and they'd really get a lot out of it. I'm someone who would rather just touch base every now and again because I tend to manage myself quite well. But I think it's absolutely huge for very many of the people who go about it. And what I find is that with regards to the support groups, it's the first step for a lot of people. Um, it's the first step towards saying, you know what, maybe there are other people who understand what this is about. Maybe I'm not alone. And I think that's a really important thing to portray to people is, you know what? We're not alone here. We're not the only person who's ever dealt with these sorts of situations before. And sitting in a room, even if you say nothing for the entire hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever it may be, if you can sit there and say, hey, I'm not the only person who's going through something, then I think that's ideal. And I think if people came away from a support group with just that feeling of, hey, I'm not the only person going through this, then I think it's worthwhile. And I absolutely would go to a support group in that setting any day of the week. What I do is I am a teacher. I work at a university teaching mental health peer work. And basically, what that is it's like mental health work and supporting people through their mental health journey. Only with peer work, it's using your own lived experience of going through mental health challenges yourself to try and help other people. And that's my professional role. Um, and naturally, that it entails that I also have my own challenges that I try to share with other people along my own journey. I studied psychology when I was at university and got quite far with it. I was a bit of a nerd, um, but the bottom line was that I realised that research wasn't for me, and I wanted something more people focused. So eventually, I went and did a Cert 4 of teaching, um, and got into the vet sector, and started teaching the mental health peer work course. There was a bit in the middle where I did some work in industry for different organisations, which I won't name here, but the bottom line was that I got some training in there about what peer work was about and how I can use my lived experience and everything like that. And based on that experience that I had, I thought, yeah, I can get in and I can teach this. Um, and I've been doing that for nearly 6 years. I found that I always had mentors that I respected who were encouraging me. Every step along the way, from the university step to the peer work step to the teaching step, there were always people there who were willing to take me on. And I was very enthusiastic. I was not going to leave until someone gave me a career in peer work. There was just no way. So eventually, what happened was I found myself experiencing a number of different situations where I'm like, okay, I can really learn from this person and I can really relate to this person's journey. And as a result, I found myself being in many situations where I felt comfortable to take next steps, which was really important. I think a lot of people who struggle with mental health related issues, they find themselves getting to that first step and feeling a bit overwhelmed and feeling like, you know what, I don't feel like I'm good enough for this. I don't feel like I have enough experience. I feel like it's too long since I was in school or something like that. They just maybe have a poor experience with someone along the way, but I was lucky. I had a lot of good influences along the way. I guess what happens next for me, I'm happy with my job in the peer work sector, um, but what I am noticing as well is that it's a sector which is ever changing, and ever evolving, and it's one that I think, and as a teacher, in my sector, you can't sort of stay in the one area and not make sure you're up to date with what's going on, and then just wait around, because otherwise the new changes pass you by. So it's, while I can say that I like my job, at the same time, um, what I will say is that it's necessary to evolve as I continue on, because it's not going to remain the same indefinitely. There are a number of reasons why that is, which I'm not really going. I don't think it makes sense to go into now, but it does change very quickly. Well, a part of the course that I teach does talk about the issues around multiculturalism in a number of different ways. Because naturally, people from different culture, for example, use language differently, and the language that we use it affects how we deal with mental health challenges, as an example. So that means that if I was to say that I have I suffer from OCD, just to me that's like, okay, I probably wouldn't use that phrase, but I mean, there are people who would say it's not a suffering thing. It's you got to focus on the positives. You got to say I manage OCD, I deal with OCD, or but to say you suffer with it, it's like, well, it's a negative part of my life now, not something that I can use as a lived experience. So the language that we use is very, very important when we're talking about how we manage our mental health issues. And when we have a different culture which uses completely different language about a mental health issue, and certainly comes from a different perspective on mental health in general, then it means that we need to be culturally aware and culturally competent with how we talk and how we communicate in order to handle that situation best. I initially, when I was studying my teaching and my training and assessment Cert 4, we were supposed to give a small presentation on a topic of our choice, and I chose something in mental health first aid, which is a course that I used to teach. But the thing is that the part that I chose to teach was a couple of slides on culture and mental health. And then this other person came up to me and said, I specialize in culture and I spend 12 hours talking about this and I don't get to the bottom of it. So how you did it in 2 slides is beyond me, which is, I completely got put in my place. I never looked at it the same way again. One of the ways, and I have mentioned somewhat about some of the misconceptions that exist, I just like to offer, as we close up, an option to helping the other person if you're in that situation. My response would be, if you're at all concerned with whether you are talking to someone with OCD or with any other condition, and you're thinking, gee, I hope that I don't say the wrong thing. I hope that I don't do the wrong thing. I hope I'm not, creating a misconception. Ask them a question. Ask them about, how would you like me to talk about this? Ask them, how do you feel about this? Ask them, what language would you like me to use? Ask more questions. And if you ask more questions and you're open to the answers, they're likely to tell you that, and they will most likely appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Empowering Voices of Harmony. Mental Health Foundation Australia is grateful to our guests for sharing their lived experiences, offering hope and a voice to others. The Mental Health Foundation Australia offers free mental health support groups on various topics, from anxiety, trauma, bipolar disorder, and many more. We also offer affordable counselling sessions at $20 per session at our Wellness Hub Psychology Clinic. Our podcast notes include helpful resources. We hope you found this episode informative. See you next time as we share more empowering voices of harmony.